Good evening. We're delighted that we have such a great big crowd here tonight. And again, welcome to Greenville, Chautauqua. I am Marion Strobel, professor of history at Furman and a former Greenville, Chautauqua board member. We are so glad that you're here this evening. First, I want to thank the Greenville County Library for sponsoring the Chautauqua Tuesday Talks. As always, please note that the library staff has very carefully selected from their collection materials that are relevant to our topic tonight. Mainly what we have tonight out there are books. These are on the table behind your seats and can be checked out. And if you don't have a library card, feel free to ask for one. No technology involved. I should also say that Greenville Chautauqua can always use volunteers to help out with our activities. If you would like to help, there's a sign-up list on the information table where you entered tonight. We also have free flyers, which I see many of you have picked up. Please take more and give them to your friends as a way of introducing them to Chautauqua. As we like to put it, friends do not let friends miss Chautauqua. And please, another message, please silence your phones or turn them off or put them on airplane mode. By doing so, you will make everyone happy. Well, you are in for a special treat tonight, as are all of us. Our speaker is Timothy Hellwig, professor of English at Furman University. His topic is Edgar Allan Poe, a writer who has probably fascinated many of us since we read The Fall of the House of Usher, The Raven, and many other of Poe's stories and poems. Probably we read these in high school or college, and I must say, The Fall of the House of Usher is my very favorite short story. I read it every November because I love the opening paragraph. So I just think it's fabulous. So at any rate, Tim is a graduate of Gettysburg College, holds an MA from Miami University of Ohio, and a PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park. He taught for a number of years at Western Illinois University before coming to Greenville. At Furman, Tim specializes in 19th century American literature, as well as on American working class literature. Tim's book, Cross-Racial Class Protest in Antebellum American Literature, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020. Tim is also the author of many articles that have appeared in such journals as American Studies, Early American Literature, and Leviathan, the Journal of Melville Studies, including a forthcoming article in that journal. These are really big deal journals. I want to put that plug in for Tim. In addition, Tim has held research fellowships from such prestigious institutions as the American Antiquarian Society and the Library Company of Philadelphia. Most recently, Tim has been awarded the M.C. Lang Fellowship in Book History, Bibliography, and Humanities Teaching with Historical Sources at the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. It's a huge honor. Needless to say, Tim has presented papers at many scholarly conferences across the United States. All this means that we are in great hands with Professor Timothy Hellwig tonight. I hope you are as excited as I am to learn all that he has to say about Edgar Allan Poe. Welcome, Tim, and we will have time for your questions afterwards.
All right. Thank you, Marion. Thank you so much. All right. Okay. All right. Can you hear me? Is it on? It's on. Thank you, Marion, for that really wonderful introduction. It's the nicest one that I've ever received. I hope I can live up to it. And I can attest that, yes, there are a lot of great Poe-related books on the back table. There's some fairly recent critical works, as well as some collections of Poe's stories. So definitely worth checking out. All right. Let's see. All right. And I'll begin. Okay. So I want to begin by thanking the Chautauqua Society for hosting me, and especially Laura Kaufman for inviting me to speak tonight about Edgar Allan Poe, and being so willing to reschedule it when we had inclement weather in January. About Edgar Allan Poe, arguably the most important and influential Southern writer of American Romantic literature, which flourished in the 3 decades prior to the Civil War. In addition to sharing details about Poe's life that you might not be familiar with, including his ties to South Carolina and his mysterious death in Baltimore, my talk, Threading the Needle Between Lowbrow and Highbrow Culture, Edgar Allan Poe as a Master Seamster, will review some of the important cultural and historical influences on his markedly Gothic and definitively, and in some ways I think underappreciated, very American writing. His contributions to the field of literary criticism that provided him with more income than his stories, poems, and novel ever did, and his enduring impact on literature and popular culture today. So Poe's writing, which did not receive sustained critical attention or enjoy widespread inclusion in American high school and college curricula until about the 1960s, reflects Poe's desire to be popular among readers and respected by critics. Despite the best efforts of his literary executor and professional nemesis, Rufus Griswold, pictured on the left, to malign Poe's reputation as a petty and jealous drunkard and even a plagiarist, Poe was in fact a hardworking and ambitious writer who wanted to be beloved by the masses and taken seriously by the primarily northern intelligentsia to thread the needle, that is, between lowbrow popularity and highbrow critical success. Given the sheer number of cinematic adaptations and the fact that adults of all ages still recall fondly, hopefully, their introduction to Poe's writing, sometimes even in middle school, no less, through the murder plot of The Telltale Heart, coupled with the fact there are now 2 peer-reviewed journals devoted exclusively to his writing, the Edgar Allan Poe Review that's published by prestigious Penn State University Press, and then Poe Studies that is published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and a richly curated digital archive maintained by the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, eapoe.org, it is safe to conclude that Poe achieved his dreams, if only posthumously, a fate that befell many of our great American writers prior to the Civil War, including the great Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, and Emily Dickinson. In that sense, Poe is in very good company. Edgar Poe, assigned no middle name at birth, was the second of 3 children born to David Poe Jr., an itinerant and not very good actor from Baltimore. At least that's what the review said. And his wife, Eliza Poe, pictured here, a talented stage actress who emigrated from England with her mother in 1796. Although Poe's paternal family hailed from Baltimore, and Poe would live there in rather abject poverty between 1831 and 1835, Poe was actually born in Boston on January 19, 1809, because his parents happened to be performing there. Pictured here is the beautiful bronze Poe sculpture in Boston that was unveiled in 2014. Whether out of professional competition with Boston's literati, such as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who he really didn't like, and with whom Poe waged a public feud in 1845 as the 2 men exchanged charges of plagiarism, and his sense that Northern critics looked down upon Southern writers, or out of love for his paternal family and his dear wife Virginia, who hailed from Baltimore, or more likely a combination of the 2, Poe often let people believe that he had been born in Baltimore, the same city where he would die and be laid to rest 40 years later. On his father's side, as some of you may know, Poe has an intriguing connection to Greenville. Many of you, are familiar with the Poe Mill, a textile mill established in 1896 and destroyed by fire about a century later. But what you may not know is that its owner, Francis Winslow Poe, was Poe's second cousin, their grandfathers having been brothers. All right. So, a sensitive and bright child, young Poe stayed with his paternal grandparents in Baltimore while his parents acted up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and in the spring of 1811 made his first trip to South Carolina, when he accompanied his mother to her performances in Charleston, likely at the ornate Dock Street Theater. We're not sure exactly which theater, but probably this one, pictured on the left. For those of you familiar with Poe's only novel, a sea adventure that is ambivalent about polar exploration and Western colonialism, and published by Harper's in 1838, the same publisher that would publish Moby Dick 13 years later. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym and its enigmatic final cry, Tekeli, which is screamed by both the, quote, gigantic and pallidly white birds, as seen on the right in an illustration from about 1896, and the indigenous people living near the South Pole. It is quite the coincidence that Eliza was starring in an English melodrama in Charleston called Tekeli. So that might be where, right? Now, tragically, his mother died of tuberculosis in December 1811 at the young age of 24. Yeah, and it is likely that his father, David, died of the same disease during the same month in the same state of Virginia, although he died probably around the Norfolk area. All right. Now, death from tuberculosis would haunt Poe's life, as his beloved foster mother, Frances Allen, pictured on the left, would also die of the disease, compounded by her asthma, in 1829, and his wife, Virginia, pictured on the right, would succumb to it in 1847 at age 24. Yeah. An airborne infection that today can be cured, usually, with rounds of antibiotics, yet still kills 1 million people annually. Tuberculosis, which damages the lungs and causes extreme weight loss, was often a death sentence during Poe's lifetime. Poe's short story, The Masque of the Red Death, about an infectious disease, was published in May 1842, just 5 months after Virginia first coughed up blood while playing and singing at the piano inside their rented home in Philadelphia in January. Poe had married his first cousin, Virginia, in 1836 when he was 27 and she was 13. Yeah, right. And they had moved from Richmond, where Poe had been working as an editor at the Southern Literary Messenger and is really credited with increasing their circulation and making them a very respectable Southern journal. They moved, though, from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1838 with Virginia's mother, Maria Clem. It was Poe's aunt. So Poe continued working as an editor in Philadelphia until he was fired for intemperance in April 1842, just prior to the publication of The Masque of the Red Death, which is the story I'm going to talk about a little, and then The Raven. The story has been read biographically as a Gothic expression of Poe's anxieties about tuberculosis generally, and his wife's faltering health specifically. And it recently enjoyed a renaissance in high school English classes during the COVID pandemic. At least this is what my Furman students inform me. We're reading that again? No. The story's fantastical reimagining of the titular disease, the Red Death, killing an individual within 30 minutes of infection, and pictured here in a 1919 illustration by Irish artist Harry Clarke, underscores Poe's worries. Quote, this is from the story, "There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men." Poe first published this well-known short story under the title, as you can see to the left, The Masque of the Red Death, M-A-S-K, which will become important in a bit, in Graham's Magazine, a Philadelphia monthly that catered to the rising middle class through its focus on literature, art, and fashion. And it offers us an excellent example of Poe's effective balancing of highbrow and lowbrow qualities of pre-Civil War fiction. The story chronicles the desperate and unsuccessful efforts of a prince, ironically named Prince Prosperous, to protect himself and his noblemen and women from a pestilence ravaging the land beyond the bolted doors of their castellated abbey. Set vaguely in Europe at a vague and distant past. Spoiler alert, everyone dies. All right. In conventionally Gothic fashion, suspense builds as the revelers repress their horror and their guilt, we hope, over all the people, the irresponsible prince's subjects that have been left behind and dying outside the abbey walls. And inevitably, their false sense of security is punctured by the sudden arrival of the Red Death. Or, perhaps Poe's story suggests, by the sudden manifestation of the figure of the Red Death, a collective expression, perhaps, of their repressed guilt. After all, the language that the narrator uses to explain that the partygoers at the stroke of midnight, quote, had found leisure to become aware of, not directly see, but to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. So the highbrow elements of this concise but powerful story of psychological horror and terror include the complex characterization of the prince, who may lack empathy for his subjects, but expresses what the narrator calls a peculiar and bizarre aesthetic sense that I think Poe actually appreciates. The sepulchral ringing of the symbolic gigantic clock of ebony that reminds revelers of their ever-approaching mortality, and the color-coded rooms that have become fodder for analysis by critic and many Furman student alike. What do all those colors mean? Formally, the story's compactness, rising action, and denouement conform to Poe's published statements about the short story as a genre. Although the American Romantic literary period from 1819 to 1865, 1819 because of the publication of Rip Van Winkle, is best known for its novels, The Scarlet Letter in 1850, Moby Dick in 1851, and then Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. The period also saw the rise of the short story as the American genre. Some critics jest that perhaps we Americans have short attention spans and prefer shorter works. But I like to think we're just so industrious that we struggle to find time for leisure. Okay. As mentioned earlier, Poe made most of his income from his reviews of contemporary literature, some of which were so biting, so caustic, that they earned him the nickname the Tomahawk Man. Illustrated on the right by prolific illustrator of the period, F.O.C. Darley, who was much in demand, and his Poe's thoughtful essays about the art of writing poetry and prose. In his review of the short story collection Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is pictured on the left, published in Graham's the same month as The Masque of the Red Death, Poe asserts that the short story is superior to the novel as a form because the novel cannot be read in one sitting. Quote, worldly interests intervening during the pauses of perusal, the phone rings, the baby cries, modify, counteract, and annul the impressions that the author intended. However, in the short story, quote, the author is enabled to carry out his full design without interruption. During the hour of perusal, the soul of the reader is at the writer's control. Poe states that the short story lends itself to the expression of, quote, terror or passion or horror, and he famously insists that fiction should not be didactic, right, overly preachy or moralizing, and it should not be preoccupied with teaching moral lessons, as much of the fiction did at that time, and characterizes much of the periodical fiction published during Poe's lifetime as well, whether it was promoting temperance reform, women's suffrage, prison reform, labor reform, or abolitionism. Finally, Poe asserts in his Hawthorne Review a fairly proto-modern, it's very ahead of its time, view about the importance of concision and precision, right? Something that we expect, we find in shorter modernist novels like The Great Gatsby or The Sun Also Rises, right? Quote, "In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design, right, of the authors." Critics may debate if Poe follows his own advice in such long and richly detailed stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, which deploys Gothic images and Gothic tropes layer upon layer, kind of like Montresor walling up Fortunato slowly in The Cask of Amontillado. But The Masque of the Red Death is an impeccably crafted short story that builds deliberately, inevitably, to a thrilling climax that evokes the reader's terror, passion, and horror. And the fact that Poe retitled the story The Masque, M-A-S-Q-U-E, of the Red Death, to highlight its resonance with the Renaissance courtly masque when he republished the story in 1845, is indicative, I think, of his desire to elevate the story and shape its interpretations by his more discerning readers, let's say. Okay. Now, the lowbrow elements of the tale, such as the sensational plot, the grotesque and preternatural mode of death, and the callous aristocrat's well-deserved comeuppance at the end, reveal a skilled author who simultaneously appealed to the burgeoning masses of readers who devoured sensational news and fiction in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. With literacy rates among Northeastern white men and women of all classes reaching a zenith in this country of 97% in 1840, and then falling only to 90% in 1850, working class and middle class and wealthy, right, readers helped to support hundreds of ephemeral daily newspapers, many of them lost, right? But not all. Weekly story papers and monthly periodicals, many of which included sensational fiction, crime reports, and, to put it in modern terms, news of the weird. So, between 1833 and 1840, the number of daily newspapers in New York City alone jumped from 65 to 138. Yeah. So, some of you may have heard about this. The New York Sun, right, which was the first penny paper you could just buy for a cent, right? The New York Sun featured, it started in 1833, but it featured in August 1835 what would become known as the Great Moon Hoax, an anonymously penned report by a scientist who claimed to have observed through his powerful telescope a colony of bat people living on the moon, as seen in the center, prompting a group of gentlemen from Yale University to travel to the city to gather more information about all this at the Sun's newspaper offices. Poe, who was a great hoaxer in his writing and must have delighted in Yale officials getting duped by a penny paper, claimed that the Sun plagiarized his own moon hoax, which he published as the tale, The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, in the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia, just 2 months earlier. Another Poe story, The Balloon Hoax, which Poe placed in the New York Sun in 1844 and is seen illustrated on the right, purported to detail the first successful transatlantic balloon crossing from Wales to, quote, the low coast of South Carolina. They landed near Fort Moultrie, supposedly. Right, it's not true. Where Poe was once stationed, right, when he was in the United States Army. The balloon hoax would inspire Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days in 1872. Verne, who admired Poe's writing, also published in 1897 a sequel to Poe's novel Pym called An Antarctic Mystery. Right, the novel is about a voyage to Antarctica, right? And similarly, H.P. Lovecraft paid Poe respect in 1936 with his elusive novella about Antarctica called At the Mountains of Madness, which some of you may be familiar with. To close out our discussion of the Masque of the Red Death infiltrating the castle and mowing down everyone regardless of class status or rank functions as the kind of charismatic, the Red Death does, I think, functions as the kind of charismatic Republican with a little r, anti-hero that satisfied working class readers of sensational news and fiction. Now returning to Poe's younger years, going back. After the death of his parents, Poe and his two siblings were split among three households. Poe's older brother Henry, who died in Baltimore of tuberculosis and possibly alcoholism in 1831, while they were all living together in Baltimore, went to live with their paternal grandparents. His younger sister Rosalie, who lived until 1874, went to live with the middle-class Mackenzie family of Richmond. And Poe was placed with John Allen, pictured on the left, a wealthy Richmond merchant and enslaver, and his wife Frances, pictured on the right, his first wife, who, without children of her own, doted on the young Poe. Allen and his wife never formally adopted Poe, although Poe did adopt Allen, spelled A-L-L-A-N, not A-L-L-E-N, one of the most persistent typographical errors in American literature that my students usually do not commit, as his middle name. Throughout Poe's short college career at the University of Virginia and his short military career in the United States Army and then West Point in 1831, Allen never provided him with sufficient financial support and coldly left Poe with no inheritance when he died in 1834. Some literary historians believe that Poe started publishing more frequently under Edgar A. Poe, and sometimes even just Edgar Poe instead of Edgar Allan Poe, in response to Allen's harsh treatment. So I want to briefly discuss an important professional relationship of Poe's that does not receive a great deal of critical attention, but I think is instructive about Poe's lifelong struggle with poverty, which I might not have emphasized enough, right? And illuminates how generous Poe could be toward younger writers. That is Poe's relationship with George Lippard, pictured on the left, an outspoken Philadelphia labor reformer, anti-slavery advocate, newspaper editor, and prolific novelist who wrote The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall, a 600-page Gothic expose of the upper classes, and what was the best-selling novel in America from 1845 until Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared as a complete novel and blew everything else out of the water in 1852. Of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin remained the best-selling, or the top-selling novel throughout the rest of the 19th century. I think only the Bible outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin. Poe and Lippard became acquainted after Poe moved to Philadelphia in 1838, and in terms of their writing aims, they could not have been more different. Lippard, who infused his sensational fiction with spirited critiques of industrial capitalism in the North and chattel slavery in the South, declared about American literature in 1851, 2 years after Poe's death. Lippard said, quote, "Our idea of a national literature is simply that a literature which does not work practically for the advancement of social reform, or which is too dignified or too good to picture the wrongs of the great mass of humanity, is just good for nothing at all," Lippard said. Okay. Poe, who lived much of his life on the edges of poverty and was not above working in a brickyard as a day laborer in Baltimore in 1834, when I think he was writing Berenice, appealed to, one of his early stories, appealed to readers with class-accented stories like The Masque of the Red Death, as well as his last published story, Hop Frog, which was published on St. Patrick's Day, 1849 in Boston. Despite their diametrically opposed goals for fiction writing, having a psychological effect on the reader for Poe versus reforming a increasingly class-stratified society for Lippard, Poe appreciated Lippard's innovative style in his Gothic novel, The Lady Annabelle, and in a letter to Lippard dated February 18, 1844, Poe writes, quote, "You seem to have been in too desperate a hurry to give due attention to the details, and thus your style, although generally nervous, is at times somewhat exuberant. But the work as a whole will be admitted by all but your personal enemies," which Poe had plenty of himself, to be richly inventive and imaginative, indicative of genius in its author. End of quote. Poe invited Lepard to make use of his letter, and Lepard did publish it in his next novel because he knew Poe's opinion carried weight with the larger reading public. One final note about Poe and Lepard. Although other letters exchanged between the two men have not survived, at least, or haven't been discovered yet, and one can only imagine how Poe must have felt about Lepard's meteoric success through writing sensational fiction, their friendship proved very helpful to Poe toward the end of Poe's life. Lepard was probably the last American novelist to see Poe alive. As Poe, still heartbroken from the loss of Virginia and still impoverished, made his way from New York City to Richmond for what would be the last time, he stopped over in Philadelphia during a sweltering July of 1849. Right? He would die in October. Penniless, Poe visited Lepard at his newspaper office, apparently missing shoes, or a shoe, Lepard's labor paper, the Quaker City Weekly, and pleaded for assistance. And in response, Lepard went around the city of Philadelphia and took up a collection from those who were willing to give money for Poe. And he even housed Poe for one night in his family's very modest home on North 6th Street, which is still standing and is pictured there on the right in Philadelphia. But there's just a little bit more. After Poe died and Rufus Griswold's slanderous obituary appeared on October 9th, in the New York Tribune, major newspaper, claiming that few, quote, few will grieve his death, that Poe had few or no friends and led a very dissipated life, and calling Poe one of America's, quote, most brilliant but erratic stars, Lepard, down in Philadelphia, responded with his own obituary on October 20th, defending Poe. Quote, Edgar Allan Poe died in the city of Baltimore on Sunday nearly 2 weeks ago. He is dead. And we are conscious that words are fruitless to express our feelings in relation to his death. Only a few weeks ago, we took Poe by the hand in our office and heard him express himself in these words, quote, I am sick, sick at heart. I have come to see you before I leave for Virginia. I am homesick for Virginia. I don't know why it is, but when my foot is once in Virginia, I feel myself a new man. It is a pleasure to me to go into her woods, to lay myself down upon her sod, even to breathe her air. And Lepard continues, that Poe had faults we do not deny. He was a harsh, a bitter, and sometimes an unjust critic, but he was a man of genius, a man of high honor, a man of good heart. He was not an intemperate man, right? So it's almost like Lepard could foresee that, one of the ways that Poe's legacy was going to be slandered was as a drunk, right? As raving alcoholic and opium user and everything. Okay. Clearly not everyone was hoodwinked by Griswold's mean-spirited obituary. Poe seems to have had a genuine friend in Lepard, a Gothic writer who would die of tuberculosis in 1854. After his wife and 3 children died of tuberculosis. Right? So now, despite John Allen's reluctance to take him in, and despite John Allen's precarious tobacco business that nearly went bust when Poe was a young boy, Poe had, by all accounts, a privileged upbringing, including attendance at prestigious private schools in Richmond and for a short time in London. From 1815 to 1820, almost 5 years, the Allens took Poe to England, where he was a strong student, especially in the classics. However, for those of you familiar with the movie Dead Poets Society, which includes the subplot of a stern father who demands his suicidal son become a doctor rather than pursue acting, it doesn't end well, right, for the son. Allen and Poe were often at loggerheads, with Allen insisting that Poe pursue a business career like him and brusquely dismissing Poe's literary aims. Once Francis Allen died and Allen remarried and had a son, and now an heir, with his second wife in 1831, Allen and Poe would be estranged until Allen died in 1834. Prior to the permanent rift, Allen did support Poe's matriculation at the newly created University of Virginia in February 1826. Poe was in just its second year. Poe, excelling at his studies and well-liked among his peers, was writing poems and sharing them with his buddies. And when Allen failed to provide him with sufficient money for his living expenses, Poe turned to gambling and drinking to cope. Here is a picture of Poe's living quarters, still preserved at 13 West Grange, Marion knows, yes, which the University of Virginia has preserved, a small and cozy room with its own fireplace, and where it is not too difficult to imagine the distraught young speaker of the Raven, perhaps a college freshman who recently lost his girlfriend, lounging in a deeply mournful and thus vulnerable state of mind, open to suggestion and maybe even susceptible to mania. Quote, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door." And before I go on, I just want to say real fast that there are a lot of these little one-room, dorm rooms that the students that apparently have 4.0s can stay in. Not that one, but okay. And so begins The Raven, the most popular poem in the English language, a 108-line poem that was reprinted widely and parodied in anonymous poems like The Craven and The Turkey, right, in the 1840s. That was recited by children in America's common schools throughout the 19th century. That was beloved by Abraham Lincoln, who carried a copy of the poem with him when he was working as a trial lawyer in the state of Illinois. That inspired endearing adaptations like the 1990 Simpsons Tree House of Horror episode that never fails to engage students. That gave Baltimore's NFL football team that's won 2 Super Bowls now their name when they arrived in Charm City in 1996. And that was performed last January, 2 Januaries ago, in an enthusiastic monologue as part of the Poe Speakeasy event here in Greenville. And maybe some of you saw it. I think someone told me they're coming back too. So, it is ironic and sad that despite the poem's popularity since its first publication with Poe's name attached in the January 29, 1845 edition of the New York Evening Mirror newspaper, Poe, who was struggling in New York to support his family since they moved there from Philadelphia in 1844, made very little money from its publication. Poe was probably paid $15, which is approximately $600 today. Granted, still no small change. He was paid by the American Whig Review, a monthly that first published the poem under the pseudonym Quarles. But due to a lack of international copyright until 1891 that protected American authors and other authors against the pirating of their works, Poe was not compensated for the poem's many reprintings. Yeah. He did, however, earn modest sums from delivering sold-out public lectures that usually included a recitation of The Raven, while he was dressed from head to toe, right, in his signature black garb. Right? Poe would recite The Raven for the last time at a lecture given at the Exchange Hotel in Richmond on September 24th, 1849, which is just a couple weeks before his death in Baltimore, challenging Griswold's and others' ill-willed speculation that Poe was out of control and acting recklessly during the last weeks of his life. Rather, we find in Richmond newspaper reports that Poe was fully capable of delivering a coherent lecture and pleasing a crowd with his best-known literary poem. Right? Okay. But what about the famous poem itself? Is it any good? Right? Despite some critics' contempt for Poe's sing-songy poetry that borrows rhythm and rhyme scheme from his contemporaries like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Poe's poetry was admired by French symbolist writers like Charles Baudelaire and Stéphane Mallarmé, whose avant-garde work influenced high modernist American poets like T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens. In that sense, Poe's poetry has had more influence on American poetry than is often perceived. And it was Baudelaire who in 1852 called out Griswold as, quote, the pedagogue vampire, for defaming Poe in the 1850 biography that Baudelaire said is, quote, wearisome and crammed with hatred. Tales of the poem's origin range from Poe having been influenced by Browning's 1844 poem, Lady Geraldine's Courtship, to the romantic testimony of a young man who claimed to have heard Poe hiking in the woods in upstate New York in the summer of 1843 while working aloud on a poem about a bird and with the single word refrain, nevermore. So the Raven meditates powerfully on the despair brought about by the loss of one's beloved, something many people can relate to. And consistent with the dualities found in much of Poe's writing, explores the tension between knowledge acquired through reason, signified by the bust of Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, which the bird alights upon, and knowledge gained through intuition or supernaturalism, signified in the poem by the raven itself, right? A bird that was treated as an ill omen, right, in Greek mythology. Bad luck. Despite the young man understanding rationally that the bird has been taught to speak the lone word nevermore by some, quote, unhappy master, and is seeking shelter from a storm during the cold and dreary month of December when the poem takes place, the grieving speaker relishes what he perversely constructs as an opportunity to acquire occult information about his lost love, Lenore, right, who has died. Through increasingly frenzied appeals to the raven that he already knows the answer to, the suffering narrator tortures himself by asking the bird such poignant questions as, will he ever receive, quote, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore? Is there balm in Gilead for his anguish? Will he one day in heaven, quote, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore? And each time, predictably, he receives the ominous and lonely response from the raven, nevermore. Like the hopeless and immutable ending of The Masque of the Red Death, the speaker of the raven is left utterly despondent from questioning the bird, which at the end sits triumphantly, darkly, atop the bust of Pallas and casts a long shadow over the speaker's remaining days. Quote, and the lamplight o'er him, streaming, throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Exactly, right? So, in addition to making money from reciting The Raven, Poe capitalized on its popularity by writing an essay about the poem's creation. He published The Philosophy of Composition in the April 1846 issue of Graham's Magazine, so a year later, which surely regretted that they rejected The Raven for publication when Poe first offered it to them. Since Poe was paid $4 per page by Graham's, his 5-page essay, The Philosophy of Composition, would have garnered $20, or about $800 today, if my math is right. Always the hoaxer, Poe imbues the essay with a tongue-in-cheek quality, claiming that he is drawing back the curtain to share with readers how he deliberately created, quote, a poem that should suit at once the popular and the critical taste. Surprisingly, Poe eschews the romantic portrayal of the author as a kind of mad genius, writing feverishly by candlelight, alone in the attic with just his thoughts, a muse, and perhaps the full moon. Instead, Poe writes, quote, he says, most writers, poets especially, prefer having it understood that they compose by a species of fine frenzy and ecstatic intuition. Instead, Poe demystifies the writing process by explaining how he sought to elevate the reader's soul through a very deliberate step-by-step process by explaining for contemplating the beautiful. That is, deploying a tone of sadness, using a repetitious refrain, and engaging the most poetical subject of all, quote, the death then of a beautiful woman. Although it is hard to know how seriously Poe intended readers to take this expose, I appreciate the methodical and recursive process of writing that Poe describes. Like, writing's never done. We're always revising, right? We're always revising. That writers always have choices to make for their audience is kind of textbook Aristotelian rhetoric. It's one of the reasons I share a quote from Poe's The Philosophy of Composition with my Furman composition students each spring. quote, "It is my design to render it manifest that no one point in the Raven's composition is referable either to accident or intuition, that the work proceeded step by step to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem," Poe said. So granted, not everyone can write the most famous poem in American literature, but everyone can improve their writing by becoming more conscious of their choices and honing their rhetorical skills. It's for the writing program coordinator here. Okay. In addition to us helping to establish the short story as the American prose genre, deploying the Gothic mode to comment on the American scene undergoing great economic transformation in the 1840s and 1850s and beyond, and contributing to the nascent genre of science fiction with his speculative novel Pym, Poe is also credited with establishing the detective story, inspiring authors from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, there is Sherlock Holmes on the right, to Agatha Christie in England, to Dashiell Hammett and Walter Mosley on this side of the pond. Poe published 3 stories featuring his brilliant, if eccentric, and probably even a little antisocial, amateur French detective, C. Auguste Dupin, a super sleuth, who uses logic and keen observation of details to solve crimes that flummox the ordinary authorities and the rest of us. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841, scene cover pictured on the left, inaugurates the locked room or impossible crime mystery that Dupin solves. Then the mystery of Marie Roget, serialized in 1842, I don't have a picture of this, emphasizes Dupin as the armchair detective who solves a case solely on information provided by others. And the Purloined Letter, published in 1844, pictured there in the center, features Dupin's psychological deduction, thinking like the criminal to solve a crime, and has become synonymous with the idea of hiding something in plain sight. So we see Poe responding through these detective stories to America's burgeoning print culture and the public's thirst for crime news, the more salacious, the better, as the 1830s and 1840s witnessed the nation's earliest high-profile sensational news stories. For example, the axe murder of prostitute Helen Jewett in April 1836 in a high-class brothel in Lower Manhattan slaked the public's thirst for crime news, which reached a fevered pitch in the New York press when the affluent, rich suspect was found not guilty, and no one was ever convicted. In Philadelphia, Lepard's best-selling novel, The Quaker City, that I've mentioned, was inspired by the trial and acquittal of Singleton Mercer, who shot dead his younger sister's seducer. And the jury said, "Good for you," right? Okay. It was the sensational crime case during the summer of 1841 of Mary Rogers, the beautiful cigar girl, whose body was discovered floating in the Hudson River, that inspired Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget. Although Poe set the story in Paris, because that's where Dupin lives, he analyzes the prevailing theories that were circulating in the American press about the cause of Mary Rogers' death, ranging from murder by a naval officer or a gang of ruffians to a bungled abortion. The case also was never solved by authorities, but Poe's tale might be the first crime story ripped from the headlines, still a popular mode as seen on the many iterations of Law and Order. Right? So, yes, Law and Order. Is it recording? Is it recording? Okay. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. Poe's death in Baltimore on October 7th, 1849 remains shrouded in mystery. One that would be ripe for the detective work of Dupin if only the subject of the inquiry was not Dupin's creator. The last 2.5 years of Poe's life were professionally productive. After Virginia died, he continued to write and publish poetry from the cottage he continued to share with her mother, Maria Clem, up in Fordham, New York, pictured in the lower right, still there. He wrote and delivered a lecture on the poetic principle that insisted the foremost goal of poetry is to elevate the soul through the contemplation of beauty. And he tried to solicit financial support and prospective subscribers for what he hoped would be the highest of highbrow literary journals that he was going to call the Stylus. Yet these years of literary productivity, during which he was not employed as an editor, were marked by continuing struggles with poverty, debilitating grief over Virginia's death, as well as necessitated numerous doctor's visits and failed attempts to stop drinking, including signing a temperance pledge with the Richmond Lodge of the Sons of Temperance just weeks before his death. So the circumstances of Poe's demise are indeed opaque, right? We know that he was discovered disheveled and confused, possibly inebriated, by a local printer, Joseph Walker, outside of the Fells Point Tavern and Polling Place, Gunners Hall, on October 3rd, 1849. It was election night, notoriously rowdy and potentially violent affairs in young America, and he was rushed to the hospital. Gunners Hall, now the Horse You Came In On saloon, pictured there on the left, was established in 1775 and continues to serve cold pints of beer and promote, as you can see, its affiliation with Poe's demise. Right. After 4 days of restless sleep, he would sit up in his hospital bed one last time and exclaim, "Lord, help my poor soul." Although the cause of Poe's death remains a matter of speculation, alcoholism, heart disease, swelling of the brain, rabies, or cooping, pictured in the upper right, which was the practice of getting men drunk, donning them in various outfits, and then forcing them to vote repeatedly. Actual voter fraud, right? I am somewhat convinced by his friend Maria Schu's amateur diagnosis that Poe was suffering from lesions on the brain that would have been exacerbated by drinking. The diagnosis is far less sensational than rabies, and it would be consistent with health problems from drinking alcohol, a disease that actually plagued the Poe family line. In a June 1843 letter written to Poe, his uncle William warned him against, quote, "the too free use of the bottle that is a great enemy to our family." Poe's funeral and burial in Baltimore on October 9, 1849, an overcast and raw day, was attended by just 4 mourners, an inauspicious start to what would become the exceptional legacy that we're celebrating tonight. His burial in an unmarked grave, pictured on the left, in the Poe family plot in the Presbyterian Westminster Hall and Burying Grounds, which is just a short walk from Oriole Park at Camden Yards and the Ravens football stadium, if you're ever in town, calls up the equally lonely funeral that closes out the great modernist novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald in 1925. Nick Carraway, a first-person narrator, a device that Poe experimented with and I think would have appreciated, describes Gatsby's funeral, quote, "The minister glanced several times at his watch, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for half an hour, but it wasn't any use. Nobody came." Given Rufus Griswold's damaging obituary in the Tribune and the slanderous biography of Poe that would encourage readers to conflate the author with his deranged narrators for decades, even students today, and given the critical perception that Poe, because his writing was popular, was little more than, say, a hack writer of horror and ghost stories, it is all the more surprising that Poe's writing was rescued from critical oblivion to become a subject of academic study. Skip to the end? Okay, skip to the end, okay. All right, so just trust me that he did, right? And now he's taught in college courses regularly, so. But to the conclusion, right? And even like Henry James changed his opinion of Poe, and okay. Ever since Poe, like Melville, pictured on the left, top left, was appreciated and recovered in the early 20th century, generations of readers and critics alike have read, analyzed, and enjoyed Poe's macabre tales and Gothic poems. Slide 22, okay. In response to Enlightenment writers like Crevecoeur and Benjamin Franklin, early American writers like Melville, Hawthorne, Frederick Douglass, Stowe, Lepard, and of course Poe, deployed the Gothic mode to evaluate how well Americans were living up to the ideals of our founding fathers in the 1840s. Although Poe's stories and poems often set in vague and remote European settings at vague and remote points in time, may not seem at first glance to be concerned with our national matters, Poe's entertaining writing, which I think function as highly stylized counter-narratives to American exceptionalism and as meditations on aberrant human psychology, spoke powerfully then and now to his readers. As much as we may believe that we are in control of our environment as well as ourselves, and there is no problem under the sun that cannot be solved with tenacity and ingenuity, Poe keeps us humble. His Gothic writing, chronicling the divided self and our propensity for self-destruction, what he famously calls the spirit of perverseness in his story, The Black Cat, in ambiguous tales that rarely offer conclusive answers to life's ultimate questions, remind us that humanity and the world itself is more mysterious, unpredictable, and unknowable than we may think. Unlike Melville's Captain Ahab, Poe seems comfortable with that lack of certainty. In fact, for Poe and his writing, it might be the defining quality of the human experience. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was a wonderful address. And now we're wondering if people have questions. This is often one of the most fun parts of Greenville Chautauqua. Yes, sir. Let me bring the microphone over, and please speak into the microphone so you can be heard.
Thank you. Is it correct that Rufus Griswold and Edgar Allan Poe at one point were also rivals for the same woman? I think it was Frances was the first name, but I don't remember the last name.
That I do not know the answer to that question about the woman. They were rival editors, right? Who both created their own lists of who are the good poets and who are the best poet. So they were kind of friendly, but also very competitive within the professional world. If they were interested in the same woman, that's possible. I'm just not sure. I don't know, but I do know that Griswold died a lonely, sad life in a New York City tenement in the mid-1850s of tuberculosis, right? So he.
Just to mention, that information I got from a PBS documentary on the life of Poe. The title of it was Edgar A. Poe, Buried Alive, which also mentioned Griswold's hack job of an obituary, among other subjects.
Yeah, and the woman that you're probably referring to is Sarah Helen Whitman, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Sorry. Yeah.
Your next question is all the way over to your left.
Oh, okay. All right.
Good evening. Wanted to ask, my understanding is that from what you've been saying is that there's certain criteria established for poetry, okay? Right. And that the two men were at each other about that.
Yeah.
Robert Frost, as we all know, once upon a time said, poetry is what the poet writes. So I find it a little bit entertaining or whatever. So where do we go from there? What do we believe at this point where poetry is concerned? Did they establish something at one time in the 1800s that we needed to abide by, and we have lost that over time?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that we've lost it, right? But I do think that Poe's writing, which was very different from Whitman, one of the things I didn't have time to talk about was Whitman came late to appreciating Poe's poetry. And if you know Whitman's poetry with his free verse, right, was really ushering in a new kind of poetry in the 1850s, right, with Leaves of Grass. Whereas Poe was doing more kind of conventional, stanza, right, the specific rhythm, and was much more kind of looking ahead maybe to the Victorian, right, the Victorian poetry. What was I going to say? That the French, right? The French always seemed to appreciate Poe more than we appreciated Poe, right? And so, the French symbolist poets that I mentioned, who really appreciated those sort of dreamscapes, right? Those kind of, extrasensory experiences. It was something that they really appreciated about Poe's writing. Yeah, yes, you're welcome. Yeah, of course.
Do we have other questions? Tim, maybe Can you tell us, speak a little more about his experience at UVA? I taught at UVA for 1 year, many years ago, and I remember
yeah.
well his
Yeah.
room and the range. It's very hard to get in to be able, if you had to be an honor student to be able to
To
live
stay
around
on
there.
the range,
But
yes.
can you tell us more about his experiences?
Well, I mean, yeah. I guess what I said in the talk, right, was that he was there. He started in just the second year, right after it had opened. He was apparently a really good student, right, particularly in the classics, and I think he had a lot of training in that in the private schools that Allen had provided him when he was younger. He was very well liked, right, apparently by the other students. But, as young people do, I guess he was also sowing his wild oats, right? Maybe partying a little too much, but also writing, right? Like I said, he was already writing and sharing his poems with people, and he was an ambitious I think that's maybe an important word for Poe, rather than intemperate, right? Or maybe you can be intemperate and ambitious, right? But,
I mean, there's been some books written about the
Yeah.
kind of partying that went on at UVA in its early years.
That's right, yeah.
That's what I'm wondering if he was partaking in that.
It's perhaps, right? But, the kind of poetry that he was writing, he would eventually be able to put poems together and publish them in Tamerlane, right? There's only 12 or 14 copies of that book remaining in the world. But it was after he left UVA. Maybe he wrote some of those poems, right, while he was at UVA, because it was shortly thereafter, right, that he went to Boston and then published his first collection of poems.
You have a question just 2 people over from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of my questions is, in your studies and your research, is there something that you found out personally that was of interest to you, that was a surprise, or something that you had not come across before in previous biographers?
Well, maybe a couple things. One, a really good biography that there are 2 great biographies of Poe. One is Kenneth Silverman's biography from, I think, the 90s. And then most recently, Richard Copley's biography, which is quite the tome, right? And Copley suggests that Frederick Douglass was familiar with the Telltale Heart, and that some of the same cadences, maybe even some of the same language that Poe used in the Telltale Heart reappears in Douglass's depiction of his one enslaver, the Auld family. So that was a piece of academic information, right, that I learned. But personally, I mean, I guess I've been studying the George Lippard figure since, I don't know, I guess the mid-1990s. And I didn't realize how friendly and professional they were with one another. Because, the typical, the take is that, Poe just had enemies everywhere and angered and ruffled feathers and everything. But he and Lippard seemed to have had a really kind of positive, working kind of relationship. That I think was based on some level, at least, of mutual respect. I mean, Poe definitely took himself very seriously, and I give him credit for that, right? He took writing very seriously, right? I mean, in that way, why Henry James should have liked Poe from the beginning, right? What took James so long, right? It's not until I guess the Golden Bowl, James's novel in 1904 or 7 or something, where a character finally says, that Pym novel is really something. But up until that time, James didn't have much use for Poe's writing. Neither did T.S. Eliot. I mean, it really took, the stuff that I wasn't able to get into, was that it's really not until, say, the 1950s and 1960s that people started taking Poe seriously. F.O. Mathiassen's, groundbreaking American Renaissance book from the early 1940s, I don't even think Poe's mentioned in it. Do you know, Lynn? He might have one page number in the index in the back, but all the attention was always focused on Emerson and Thoreau and Melville for good reason, and Nathaniel Hawthorne for good reason. And Poe always seemed to be kind of treated as sort of a second, which I think is also how he felt, right? I think, you know, with most of the literary journals and the critics, you know, in the northern parts of America, like very stratified in that way. I think Poe always kind of had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder coming from the South. But when I was thinking about, I was trying to do all the numbers, the year, he spent a lot of time in the North, right? After he moved to Philadelphia from Richmond in 1838, I think he was in the North for the rest of his life. I mean, granted, that's still only 11 years, but that's a lot of time, right? For someone that only lived 40 years, right? So, you know, he spent a lot of time in the North, and yeah, so anyway.
Okay, over on your left again.
I guess the connection that is the most striking for me among the many that you've brought up is between Poe and Baudelaire. And so can you be a little more specific about how Poe's poetry might show up in Fleur de Mal?
I mean, I guess the main thing would be symbolism, right? I mean, my expertise is primarily in prose, right? Prose fiction, novels, short stories, but I do study, right, poetry of the 19th century. But the French symbolists, that's pretty, far afield, right? But nevertheless, I mean, they certainly, I guess the main thing I would talk about is the formal element of symbolism, right? That Poe, as I did, right, show in The Raven, right, has these really kind of, deeply, laden with meaning symbols, kind of larger than life symbols, which also feels very consistent with American Romanticism, right? And so that's something that could have inspired Baudelaire.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I just have a piece of trivia.
Okay.
I'm from Baltimore.
All right.
And my grandfather was approached by the Edgar Allan Poe Society in 1969, in the late 60s. And they said one of his stories had to have been written from his attic in downtown Baltimore.
Wow.
Do you know anything about that? He lived on Eastern Avenue in what is called Little Italy now.
Yes.
But it was a 4-story house. It says the
little
view-
brick house.
little brick row home, kind of like what you
Yes.
showed.
Yes, I've been there many times. But I mean, I do think that is when he was writing, I don't know 100%, right? But I'm from York, Pennsylvania, if you've heard of York, right? And lived in Baltimore for a year, love Baltimore so much. I mean, I think that is when Poe was writing some of those early stories like Berenice, Morella, Message Found in a Bottle, right? One of the stories that earned him some prize money early in his writing career. He probably wrote that at that time. But as for like a specific story, like that I'm not 100% on. But where I would go is eapoe.org. It's a really well-curated digital archive by the Poe Society of Baltimore. It's so great. It's so great. You can also do keywords. They have a Google thing. You can do keyword searches and bring up references and all of Poe's writing as well as writing about Poe. It's really great. So
All right, well, I think maybe we should put an end to this. The library staff has to clean up and go home and close up shop. So thank you so much, and thank you to a great audience.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.